I still remember the moment my family decided my future without asking me. It happened 2 weeks after my graduation, and the strange part was not what they said but how calm they were when they said it. No yelling, no tension. Just quiet confidence, like the ending of my story had already been agreed on somewhere behind my back. That was the first second I understood something important. They were not inviting me to a conversation, they were announcing a verdict. And the reason I stayed silent was not weakness, it was because I already knew something they did not. Before we continue, if you still believe in your heart that God is always watching, always silently arranging everything, then right now, please leave an amen comment below the video. Because who knows, the moment you write those words, blessings may quietly come into your life. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 24 years old, and I grew up learning how to disappear in my own family without anyone noticing. If you had asked my parents, they would have said we were close. If you had asked our neighbors, they would have described us as polite and successful. But inside our house, love was measured and distributed carefully, and I was never the one standing at the front of the line. My older brother Daniel was always the center. His mistakes were called learning experiences. His needs were treated like emergencies. When he spoke, people listened. When I achieved something, it was acknowledged with a nod and quickly folded into expectation. I learned early that being quiet made life easier, so I became good at it. Too good. The only place where that version of me did not exist was my grandparents' lake house outside Seattle. It was not big or impressive. It smelled like old wood and pine and summer rain, the kind of place where time moved slower and no one rushed you to explain yourself. My grandparents never asked me to prove anything. They trusted me with small things at first, then bigger ones, grocery runs, appointments, paperwork. As they got older, I was the one who showed up on ordinary days. Not holidays, not photo moments, just days. When they passed away, the house became quiet in a different way, sad but familiar. I stayed there while finishing school, and after graduation, it felt natural to remain. It was the last place that still felt like mine, or at least I thought it was. That is why the call from my mother felt strange before she even said anything. She suggested a family check-in, her words, not mine. She said it casually, like we were meeting for coffee. When I arrived, my father was already seated. Daniel sat beside him, relaxed and confident. No one asked how I was doing. No one mentioned graduation. We skipped straight to the point. My mother folded her hands and smiled the way she always did when something was already decided. She said, "We have been talking, and we think it makes the most sense for Daniel to take over the lake house. You have your own life starting now. You will need to move out by the end of the month." They said it gently, almost kindly, as if they were helping me. Daniel did not look surprised. He leaned back like someone already picturing new furniture in familiar rooms. My father added that the house required management and responsibility. My mother said it was about balance and fairness. I did not interrupt. I did not argue. I just listened. And that is where the hook begins, because what they thought was my hesitation was actually calculation. They believed silence meant I was processing loss. What they did not know was that I was already remembering every moment that had led to this. I remembered how my parents only visited my grandparents when something needed discussing, how Daniel never stayed long enough to help, how paperwork always ended up in my hands. I remembered the questions that started appearing right after the funeral. Casual questions, curious questions, questions that slowly became assumptions. I also remembered something else. A pattern. Every time something was taken quietly from someone else, it started with concern and ended with certainty. I had seen it before, and I was not going to pretend I had not, so I nodded. I said okay. That one word changed everything. It relaxed them. My mother exhaled. Daniel smiled wider. They thought the story would end the way it always had, with me stepping aside. But here is what makes this story different. Right after my graduation, before that meeting, before that smile, I had already taken one quiet step that could not be undone. And the reason I am telling you this now is because what happened next only worked because they underestimated how observant I had become. I left that meeting without confrontation, without tears, without promises. They believed I was preparing to let go. In reality, I was preparing to stay. And if you think this was about anger or revenge, you are wrong. This was about survival, about choosing not to disappear one last time. If you have ever been pushed aside by people who assumed you would not fight back, then you already understand why I stayed quiet that day. Because sometimes the strongest move is letting them think they have already won. People think becoming invisible happens all at once. It does not. It happens in small moments that teach you where you stand. And once you learn that lesson early enough, it shapes everything that comes after. I learned mine long before the lake house, long before graduation, long before my family ever sat me down and decided my future without me. I was not born the forgotten one. I became her. My brother Daniel was 3 years older than me, and from the beginning, the difference was clear. When he walked into a room, people turned toward him. When I followed, it was like the air settled back into place. Nothing wrong had happened, nothing dramatic, just an absence of attention that felt normal to everyone except me. At family dinners, Daniel talked and my parents listened. If he struggled at school, my mother called teachers and tutors. If I struggled, I was told it would build character. When he won something, it was celebrated. When I did well, it was expected. I was not punished. I was simply overlooked. And somehow that hurt more because it gave me nothing to push against. I learned quickly that taking up space made people uncomfortable. Asking questions slowed things down. Wanting reassurance was seen as neediness. So I adapted. I became efficient. I stopped asking. I stopped expecting. I learned how to read a room and remove myself emotionally before anyone else had to. Here is the hook most people do not realize. Families like mine do not break you loudly. They train you quietly until you break yourself. By the time I was a teenager, I was already managing my own emotions like a liability. I brought home good grades without comment. I made decisions without discussion. I told myself independence was strength, even when it felt like loneliness. My parents praised how easy I was. That word easy followed me for years, and I did not understand its cost until much later. Daniel, on the other hand, was never asked to be easy. He was allowed to be loud, uncertain, demanding. If he failed, it was because someone else had not supported him enough. If he succeeded, it was proof of his potential. The family narrative bent around him naturally like gravity. I do not blame him entirely. He grew up inside a system that rewarded him for existing. I grew up inside one that rewarded me for disappearing. The only place that pattern did not follow me was my grandparents' lake house. When I stayed there, I did not have to perform usefulness to earn calm. My grandmother asked how I felt, and waited for the answer. My grandfather trusted me with responsibilities, not because I was convenient, but because he believed I could handle them. It was the first time my presence did not feel conditional. As my grandparents aged, those visits turned into routines. I handled paperwork. I learned their schedules. I showed up without being asked, not because I wanted praise, but because it felt right. I did not announce what I did. I did not document it. I just did it. My parents noticed only when something went wrong, a missed bill, a doctor visit they had not known about. They would comment how responsible I was in that distant, approving way that never quite translated into support. Daniel rarely came. When he did, it was brief, loud, performative, then gone. Still, I told myself this was normal, that families balance themselves out, that someone has to be the steady one, someone has to absorb the quiet work. I convinced myself that role had value, even if no one said it out loud. Graduation should have been my turning point. I walked across that stage knowing my grandparents were gone, but believing something of them remained in me. That house, those summers, that sense of being seen. I thought those memories protected me. What I did not realize yet was that my family had been watching too. Watching, not me, but the house, the asset. The silence I had maintained for years had taught them something dangerous. It taught them I would not object. That belief did not come from nowhere. It was built slowly from every moment I chose peace over confrontation. Every time I let something go because it seemed easier, every time I stayed quiet to keep the room comfortable. And here is the part that matters most. When you grow up being the background child, you start believing conflict means failure. You mistake survival for weakness. You think drawing a line will cost you love, even when that love was never freely given. By the time my parents called that family meeting, they were not testing me. They were relying on a pattern I had spent my life reinforcing. They believed I would step back because I always had. They believed I would accept fairness defined without me, because I always had. But something had already changed inside me. Not suddenly, Not dramatically, quietly. Living alone in that lake house after graduation gave me space I had never had before. Space to notice how often I had adjusted myself for others. Space to see how much I had carried without acknowledgement. Space to understand that silence can be strategic, but only if it leads somewhere. That is why when my parents smiled and told me to move out, I did not feel shocked. I felt clear. The shock had already happened years earlier. What I felt then was recognition. They were about to take something from me because they believed I would let them. And for the first time in my life I understood that disappearing had protected them more than it had protected me. That realization did not make me angry. It made me careful, and careful people do not react, they prepare. If you have ever been the one who kept things running quietly while others took credit, then you know exactly what I am describing. And if you think this part of the story is slow, it is because the real turning points in life rarely announce themselves. They arrive as understanding. What came next was not loud, but it was deliberate, and it began the moment I stopped confusing silence with surrender. The lake house was never just a building to me. It was the only place where I did not have to rehearse who I was before opening my mouth. And that difference mattered more than I understood at the time. Most people imagine safety as something dramatic. Protection, defense, someone stepping in front of you. For me, safety sounded like wind moving through trees at night, and no one correcting the way I breathed. It looked like a kitchen table where silence was not treated as a problem that needed fixing. That was the lake house. It sat just far enough from the water that you could hear the waves without feeling watched by them. The paint peeled a little on the porch railings. The floorboards creaked in specific places that never changed. My grandparents never bothered to fix those sounds. They said a house should be allowed to remember itself. I believed them. When I stayed there as a child, time felt slower. Mornings started without urgency. My grandmother would pour coffee and ask questions she actually waited to hear the answers to. My grandfather trusted me with small responsibilities not because I was the easiest choice but because he saw something steady in me. Each task felt like an invitation instead of an obligation. As they grew older, I became part of the rhythm of the house. I learned where paperwork was kept, which bills came when, which medications needed refills. I noticed patterns before anyone asked me to. I showed up on days that were not special, days no one took photos of. That kind of presence builds quietly. It does not announce itself. My parents and Daniel visited too, but it was different. Short stays, loud conversations, plans that involved rearranging things without understanding why they were where they were. They talked about upgrades and value. My grandparents smiled politely, but always looked at me afterward like they were checking if I noticed the difference. I did. Here is the hook people miss. The house did not feel like it belonged to my grandparents alone. It felt like it was teaching me something. How to stay, how to listen, how to exist without apology. When my grandparents passed away, the silence changed, but it did not disappear. Grief settled into the walls like dust. I walked through each room carefully touching familiar edges, letting memory guide my steps. My parents talked about next steps. Daniel talked about what should be done. I stayed quiet. I always stayed quiet. After the funeral, I did not rush back to the city. I stayed. I told myself it was practical, that someone needed to handle loose ends. But the truth was simpler. I needed the house, and the house seemed to hold space for me in return. Living there alone after graduation felt like standing inside a paused moment. I woke up early without alarms. I made tea in the same chipped mug my grandmother used. I sat on the porch and watched the water move without feeling like I was falling behind. For the first time, I was not performing stability. I was experiencing it. That is when the questions started. They did not come all at once. They arrived wrapped in concern. My mother asked what my long-term plan was. My father mentioned property taxes. Daniel stopped by under the excuse of checking in. His eyes drifted across the rooms, like he was already making decisions. At first, I brushed it off. Families talk. Assets bring conversations. I told myself I was being sensitive, but something in my chest tightened each time they spoke about the house, as if I were temporary, as if my presence was a placeholder, until something better arrived. One afternoon, Daniel asked casually if all the utilities were still in my name. He smiled while he said it, the kind of smile that assumes agreement. I answered calmly and watched how quickly he nodded, as if confirming something he already believed. That night, I walked through the house differently. I noticed how much of myself lived there. The paperwork I had organized, the repairs I had scheduled, the routines I had built without asking permission. I realized something uncomfortable. I had treated the house like a responsibility. They were treating it like a prize, and prizes in my family were never meant for people like me. I thought back to childhood dinners, to how Daniel spoke while I listened, to how silence had always been my contribution. I understood then why the house mattered so much to me. It was the only place where silence was not mistaken for consent. Here's the turning hook. The house did not just feel like home. It felt like the last boundary I had never defended. And once I recognized that I could not unsee it, I stopped dismissing the comments. I started listening to what was underneath them. Fairness, balance, what makes sense. These words had always been used when something was about to be taken quietly. I remembered other relatives, other situations. The pattern was familiar. That was when the lake house stopped being just a memory. It became a line. I did not tell anyone this, not my parents, not Daniel. I continued my routines. I smiled. I stayed calm. But inside, something shifted. I was no longer waiting to be included. I was deciding what would be protected. Standing on the porch one evening, watching the water darken, I realized something my grandparents had known all along. Peace does not come from avoiding conflict. It comes from knowing where you belong. And for the first time I understood that belonging is something you sometimes have to defend quietly before anyone realizes you are capable of it. We've poured a lot of time and heart into creating this story. If you don't like it, give it a like anyway, and if you do enjoy it, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Now, let's get back to the story. The shift did not announce itself. It never does. It arrives quietly disguised as concern, and by the time you recognize it, the tone has already changed. That was how my family began circling the lake house. At first it sounded reasonable, almost caring. My mother called one evening while I was washing dishes and asked how I was holding up living there alone. She said alone twice, like it was something fragile. I told her I was fine. She hummed thoughtfully and said it was a lot of responsibility for one person. I remember watching the water ripple in the sink and thinking how strange it was that the house had only become heavy once they wanted it. My father followed a few days later. He never wasted words. He mentioned property taxes and maintenance, asked if I had considered what might happen if something broke unexpectedly. He said these things in the same tone he used when explaining why Daniel needed help and I needed patience. Calm, authoritative, final. Then Daniel started showing up. He never called ahead. He would appear with a smile and a reason that sounded harmless, dropping off something Mom thought might be mine, checking to see if the mail had been forwarded correctly. Each visit followed the same pattern. He talked casually while his eyes wandered. The walls, the shelves, the view. He asked questions that did not require answers. He asked them anyway. One afternoon he leaned against the counter and said, "You know, it might be easier if this place stayed in the family in a more balanced way." He laughed after saying it like it was a joke. I smiled back and said nothing. He took my silence as agreement. That was the moment I understood the hook of this part of the story. They were not worried about me. They were positioning themselves. The conversations became more coordinated after that. My parents mentioned fairness, family unity, what my grandparents would have wanted. They spoke as if my grandparents had never trusted me, as if they had not watched me show up when no one else did. They spoke with confidence because confidence had always worked before. I recognized the language immediately. It was the same language used whenever something needed to be taken without confrontation. No accusations, no demands, just inevitability, just logic, just concern. I started noticing timing. The calls always came after long silences. The visits increased when I spent more time there. Questions about paperwork appeared out of nowhere. Daniel asked once if all the bills were still set up correctly. He said correctly the way someone says legally. I answered evenly and watched his shoulders relax. They believed I was overwhelmed. That belief was useful to them, so I let it live. What they did not realize was that I had begun to listen differently. I was no longer responding to the words. I was responding to the intent underneath them, and the intent was clear. They saw the house as something unfinished, until it was no longer mine. One night after my parents left, I sat alone at the table and replayed every conversation from the past month. The concern, the smiles, the shared phrases. It felt rehearsed, and that realization brought back a memory I had avoided for years. I remembered a relative who once lent money to my parents during a difficult time. It was supposed to be temporary. Then, months passed. The story changed. When the relative asked about repayment, she was called difficult, ungrateful, greedy. The narrative flipped so quickly it made my head spin. I remembered how everyone agreed with my parents, how silence filled the room like approval. That was the moment something inside me hardened into clarity. This was not about misunderstanding. This was a pattern. And patterns only work when you keep playing your part. The house had made me feel safe. But safety without boundaries is just borrowed time. I did not confront anyone. Not yet. I did not accuse or defend. I continued my routines. I answered questions politely. I let them believe what they wanted to believe, because the more certain they became, the less carefully they moved. Inside, I was doing something different. I was preparing. I began documenting everything quietly. Dates, phrases, assumptions, the way my mother said we, instead of asking me, the way Daniel spoke as if decisions were already made. I did not know yet exactly what I would need. I only knew that waiting was no longer an option. Standing on the porch one evening watching the water darken, I realized the house was no longer just a place I loved. It was a test. And for the first time in my life, I was not interested in passing by, being agreeable. The concern continued. The smiles stayed warm. The pressure increased slowly. And with every conversation, my resolve grew quieter and stronger. If you have ever felt that moment when concern starts to feel like control, you already understand why I stopped doubting myself right then. Comment 1 if this part of the story feels familiar to you. Because what came next did not happen by accident. It happened because I finally recognized the difference between being trusted and being targeted. There is a moment when doubt stops being confusion and starts becoming a warning. It is quiet and easy to miss if you are used to explaining things away. I almost missed it too, but once it surfaced, I could not force it back down. The hook came from a memory I did not expect. It happened late one night after my parents had called again about the house. Nothing new, just the same careful concern dressed up in different words. I hung up and sat alone at the kitchen table listening to the refrigerator hum. That sound carried me back years to a different room and a different kind of silence. I remembered watching my parents borrow money from a relative when I was younger. It was framed as temporary, necessary, family helps family. Months passed, then more months. The topic stopped coming up. When the relative finally asked about repayment, the story shifted instantly. She was suddenly demanding, ungrateful, causing tension. I remembered how the room turned against her, how easily everyone agreed that she was the problem. What stayed with me was not the money. It was how fast the truth was rewritten. That memory settled into my chest like a weight, because I recognized the same pattern unfolding now. The same language, the same calm certainty, the same assumption that silence meant permission. That was the moment I stopped asking myself if I was imagining things. I replayed every recent conversation with my family. The way my mother said we need to think long-term without ever asking what I wanted. The way my father spoke about responsibility like it only applied to me. The way Daniel joked about renovations while watching my face for a reaction. None of it felt accidental anymore. I realized something unsettling. They were not testing my boundaries. They were acting as if I did not have any. That realization did not make me angry. It made me alert. I began to notice how often I had trained them to expect compliance. Every time I chose quiet over correction, every time I stepped back to avoid discomfort, I had taught them who I was allowed to be in this family, and now they were acting accordingly. Here is the hook most people miss. The hardest patterns to break are the ones that once kept you safe. Silence had protected me growing up. It kept things smooth, it reduced conflict, it helped me survive emotionally, but it had also taught them that I would always adjust first, that I would absorb pressure quietly, that I would make room when asked. The lake house had given me space to see that clearly. Distance changes perspective, and with that distance came something unfamiliar. Resolve. I stopped dismissing my instincts. When something felt off, I let it feel off. I did not rush to explain it away. I let it sit. And the longer it sat, the clearer the shape became. This was not about misunderstanding or communication. It was about entitlement. They believed the house would eventually be theirs to redistribute because they believed I would not stop them. They were already behaving as if ownership was a formality waiting to be completed. Once I saw that I understood something else too. Waiting would only make it easier for them. That was a terrifying thought. Because waiting had always been my default. It was how I survived childhood. It was how I avoided confrontation. But this situation was different. Waiting did not mean peace. It meant erasure. I thought about my grandparents then. About how they trusted me. How they never rushed decisions. How they believed care was shown through consistency, not volume. I thought about how disappointed they would be if they knew I had let fear decide for me. That thought hurt more than the idea of conflict ever could. So, I made a decision quietly. Not the kind you announce. The kind you commit to internally. I decided I would not let the story be rewritten this time. I did not yet know exactly what I would do. I only knew what I would not do. I would not confront them emotionally. I would not argue with assumptions. I would not beg to be seen. Instead, I would prepare. I started documenting everything carefully. Dates, messages, phrases that implied ownership, moments where decisions were spoken as conclusions. I did not respond differently outwardly. I stayed calm. I stayed polite. I stayed predictable. They mistook my steadiness for hesitation. But inside, something had shifted. I was no longer hoping they would be fair. I was planning for the moment they would not be. That shift changed how I carried myself. I listened more closely. I spoke less. I paid attention to timing, to confidence, to where pressure was coming from, and why. And here is the part I want you to hear clearly. Choosing to protect yourself does not require anger. It requires honesty. Honesty about patterns. Honesty about history. Honesty about what happens if you do nothing. If you have ever ignored a warning because it was easier than facing what it meant, then you understand why this moment mattered. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it, and pretending after that becomes a choice. If this realization feels familiar to you, take a second and like this video, not for me but for yourself, because recognizing a pattern is often the first step toward breaking it. The decision did not arrive with confidence. It arrived with exhaustion. The kind that settles in when you realize pretending nothing is wrong takes more energy than facing the truth. That was my hook moment, not anger, not fear. Just the understanding that if I kept waiting, I would lose something quietly and permanently. I remember the morning clearly. It was an ordinary weekday, and that made it worse. No drama to hide behind, no excuse to delay. I woke up early in the lake house and sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone. My parents had texted the night before asking when we could all talk again about the house. Daniel added a message right after. Short. Confident. We should sort this out soon. Sort this out. Those words felt heavier than they should have. I realized something uncomfortable then. Every major decision in my life had been made around me, not with me. College choices, expectations, sacrifices. I had adapted so well that no one noticed I had never agreed. And now they were about to make the final decision without resistance, because resistance had never been part of my role. Here is the hook that changed everything. I finally understood that staying quiet was no longer neutral. It was participation. I took a long lunch break from work that day, and drove into the city without telling anyone where I was going. The building I walked into was quiet and unremarkable. Glass doors, neutral carpet, a small sign with a last name I barely noticed. I almost turned around. Not because I thought I was wrong, but because taking this step felt like crossing an invisible line I had been trained not to see. The attorney listened without interrupting. That alone surprised me. I explained the house, my grandparents, the visits, the comments, the assumptions, the way my family spoke as if outcomes were already decided. I expected skepticism. I expected him to tell me I was overreacting. He did not. Instead, he asked careful questions. Who paid which bills? Who handled maintenance? Who had access to paperwork? How decisions had been communicated? Each answer tightened something inside me. Not fear, validation. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and said something that settled deep into my chest. If your family believes they are entitled to this property, waiting will only make it easier for them. That sentence did not scare me. It clarified me. He explained my options slowly. What could be protected? What could be challenged? What happened when families acted first and sorted truth later? He did not dramatize anything. He did not promise victory, he spoke in probabilities and process, and for the first time in this situation I felt grounded. The choice was not about punishment or revenge. It was about structure, about removing ambiguity before it could be used against me. I made the decision there without asking for time. That surprised even me. I had always needed time to consider others, time to soften outcomes, time to make myself smaller. But this decision did not feel rushed. It felt overdue. The paperwork was not dramatic. No raised voices, no emotional language, just pages, dates, signatures, explanations of what each document meant and why it mattered. The concept of an irrevocable trust was explained carefully. Once established, it could not be undone casually. That permanence was the point. As I signed, I noticed my hands were steady. That surprised me too. Walking back outside afterward, the city felt louder than usual. Cars, voices, movement. But inside I felt quiet in a new way. Not the quiet of withdrawal, the quiet of alignment. I did not tell my parents. I did not tell Daniel. I did not change how I spoke or behaved. I answered calls. I responded to messages. I let them continue believing what they already believed. That I was unsure, that I was overwhelmed, that I would eventually step aside. Because here is something no one tells you. When people assume you are weak, they move faster, they take bigger risks, they stop checking details, and that was exactly what I needed. The paperwork did not change my life outwardly right away. I still went to work. I still stayed at the house. I still smiled through conversations that carried quiet pressure underneath them. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer hoping for fairness. I was relying on preparation. That is where this part of the story invites debate. Some people will say, I should have talked to them first. That family deserves conversation before protection. Others will say, I did exactly what was necessary, that boundaries do not require permission. I am curious what you think. Should I have confronted them emotionally before taking legal action, or was silence the only language they would respect? Comment your perspective, because this story changes depending on how you answer that question. Because what happened next only happened because they believed I was still standing still, and that belief would cost them more than they ever expected. The hardest part was not what I did next, it was what I did not do. After the paperwork was finished, and the decision was locked into place, every instinct in me wanted to breathe differently, to sit straighter, to speak with more confidence, to finally stop absorbing things quietly. But I knew better. Because the moment they sensed change, they would slow down, and I needed them moving exactly the way they already were. Here is the hook most people underestimate. Sometimes the smartest move is not revealing strength, it is allowing others to believe you have none. So, I stayed the same. I answered my parents' calls with the same calm tone. I listened without interrupting. I nodded at the right moments. When my mother asked if I was feeling overwhelmed managing the house alone, I let the word overwhelmed sit in the air without correcting her. When my father offered to help look into options for the future, I thanked him politely. Daniel kept stopping by, and I greeted him like nothing had changed. They mistook consistency for hesitation. Dinner invitations became more frequent after that. My mother suddenly wanted to reconnect. She spoke about family traditions, about how hard it was now that everyone was busy. My father mentioned how important it was to stay united as a family. Daniel joked about how quiet the house would feel once it was finally organized properly. Finally organized. That phrase came up more than once. Each visit followed a pattern. They tested a little more each time. A suggestion phrased as advice. An assumption slipped into conversation. Daniel once said, when we start fixing the deck, and stopped mid-sentence to watch my reaction. I smiled and asked what he meant. He laughed and said nothing. Just thinking out loud. They believed my calm meant uncertainty, that I was still weighing options, that I needed guidance. That belief made them careless. Behind the scenes, I was doing the opposite of careless. I began documenting everything in detail. Dates, times, who said what and how it was phrased, messages that implied ownership, comments that framed decisions as already made. I did not respond differently. I simply recorded. Patterns became clearer when written down. The pressure was subtle but constant. I also paid attention to timing. When calls came, when visits increased, when urgency appeared, it always followed the same rhythm. The more confident they felt, the less cautious they became. Daniel especially. He started acting like the house was already his. He talked about contractors he knew, about changes that would improve value, about how my grandparents would have wanted the place updated. He said that last part often, always with a smile. Always without asking me. I never corrected him. Here is the quiet truth. Playing the role they expect is not about deception, it is about control. I was no longer reacting to them. I was observing them. My parents talked more openly around me now. They discussed logistics instead of hypotheticals. My mother once said we should probably figure out paperwork soon so things do not get complicated later. She said it like a gentle warning. I nodded. Inside, I felt steady. I noticed something else during that time. The more polite I was, the more entitled they became. Kindness was not being returned. It was being interpreted as permission. And that confirmed I had made the right decision. If I had confronted them early, the narrative would have shifted instantly. I would have been emotional, difficult, unreasonable. I had seen that playbook before. Instead, I gave them nothing to push against. They believed I was standing still. Meanwhile, my days at the lake house changed quietly. I paid closer attention to details. I organized documents. I secured copies. I made sure everything I needed was accessible. I did not rush. Preparation is not loud. Some nights, I sat on the porch and watched the water darken and asked myself if I was doing the right thing. Not morally, strategically. Was staying silent worth the discomfort? Was letting them think they were winning a mistake? The answer always came back the same. Yes. Because silence was no longer something being done to me. It was something I was using. The moment that sealed it came during a casual visit from Daniel. He leaned against the counter and said we might need to move quickly so everything transitions smoothly. He did not ask who he was. He did not explain why quickly mattered. He assumed agreement. I looked at him and smiled. I said okay. That one word did exactly what it had done before. It relaxed him. He left confident, almost relieved. And I realized then how close they were to making their move. They were done testing. They were preparing to act. And that was exactly where I needed them. Because when people believe the outcome is guaranteed, they stop checking locks. They stop verifying facts. They bring movers instead of questions. They show their hand. What came next would not have worked if I had shown even a hint of resistance. It only worked because they believed I was still who I had always been. The quiet one. The accommodating one. The one who would step aside. They had no idea that while they were planning to take the house had already been protected. And the moment they crossed the line was already coming closer than they realized. Thank you for staying with us this far. If you're busy or need to step away right now, hit subscribe or hit like so you can easily find this video again later. Now, let's get back to the story. The first sign was urgency, not panic, not anger. Urgency always arrives dressed as concern but moves with intention. That was the hook I noticed immediately. Because urgency is what people use when they believe time is running out and leverage is finally theirs. My mother called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work. Her voice was softer than usual but tighter around the edges. We need to talk soon, she said about the house. It should really be in person. This can't wait much longer. She said can't wait like it was a shared problem, not a choice they were making. An hour later, Daniel texted. Short and confident, just like always. We will come by this weekend. Easier to explain everything face to face. Everything. That word landed heavy. I did not ask what needed explaining. I did not ask why it was suddenly urgent. I already knew. After weeks of assumptions and pressure, they were done circling. They were ready to act, and they believed they had already won. That night I walked through the house slowly, touching familiar edges, grounding myself in the quiet. I noticed how calm I felt. Not numb, not detached. Calm. The kind of calm that comes when you stop hoping people will do the right thing and start preparing for what they will actually do. They arrived on Saturday morning together, two together, parked close, smiling too much. Daniel stepped out first, like he always did already, leading the moment. My parents followed standing shoulder to shoulder. It looked rehearsed, and that was the moment I knew this was not a conversation. It was a presentation. We sat at the kitchen table. My mother folded her hands. My father cleared his throat. Daniel leaned back, relaxed like someone waiting for applause. Then my mother spoke. We took care of the paperwork, she said gently. We fixed everything so it would be simpler for everyone. Daniel slid a folder across the table toward me. Thick, crisp, official-looking. He smiled as he did it, the smile of someone who believes the hard part is already over. "The house is in my name now," he said. "We figured it was cleaner that way. You will need to be out by Friday so we can start moving forward." Friday. A deadline. That was the hook. Because deadlines are not requests, they are declarations. My father added that this was not personal, that I had my own life in the city, that the house needed someone who could really manage it. My mother said it was about what made sense for the family. They said all of this calmly, kindly, like they were offering advice. I looked at the folder without touching it. The documents looked real at a glance. Blue ink, stamps, signatures, confidence, printed into every page. They believed this was finished. Here is the part that mattered most. I did not feel shocked. I felt confirmed. Everything I had prepared for was happening exactly as expected. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse them of lying. I did not ask questions. I simply said, "Okay." That word again. It worked exactly the same way it always had. Daniel relaxed visibly. My mother exhaled. My father nodded like order had been restored. They mistook my calm for surrender. Daniel stood and said, "We will be back soon, probably with movers. It is easier if we handle it all at once." I nodded. I even smiled. They left satisfied. Certain. Already discussing logistics as they walked to the car. I stood at the door and watched them drive away, feeling the strange stillness settle back into the house. That stillness was not fear. It was timing. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was anxious, but because I was alert. I replayed every word, every assumption, every moment they had crossed from suggestion into decision. I knew exactly what would happen next. 2 days later they returned. This time, they brought a moving truck. It pulled into the drive, loud and unmistakable white against the muted sky. 2 movers jumped out, stretching already, scanning the house like it was just another job. My parents stepped out, energized. Daniel looked triumphant. "This will go fast," he said, clapping his hands once. "We will have you out before lunch." I stepped onto the porch, but I was not alone. Standing beside me was a man they did not recognize. Calm, middle-aged, neatly dressed. He held a folder under his arm, thick and unmistakably official. The moment stretched. The movers slowed. One of them stopped mid-step, sensing the shift. Daniel's smile faltered. My parents exchanged a look. The man stepped forward and spoke before anyone else could. "I need to confirm who I am speaking with," he said evenly. He listed their names without hesitation. "I am here regarding the legal status of this property." My father frowned. "Who are you?" The man opened the folder just enough for them to see the documents inside. "I represent the local property records office. This house was transferred into an irrevocable trust several weeks ago. Evelyn is the sole trustee." Silence crashed down hard. Daniel laughed, sharp and nervous. "That is not possible. We have paperwork." The man nodded. "I have seen it. Any attempt to change ownership without authorization from the trustee is legally void." My mother's face drained of color. "There must be a mistake," she said. "We corrected an error." "There was no error," he replied calmly. "And any further attempt to take possession of this property could escalate into a legal matter." The movers looked at each other, uncertain. One cleared his throat. "Should we wait?" "No," the man said. "You should not proceed." Daniel turned to me, eyes wide. "You did this." I met his gaze evenly. "I protected what was not yours to take." That was the moment the story changed. Not because I yelled, not because I won an argument, but because the assumption they had built everything on finally collapsed. And what happened after that was not loud. It was final. The moment after the words landed was stranger than any argument I had ever imagined. There was no shouting, no dramatic collapse, just a hollow quiet that felt heavier than noise. The kind of silence that happens when people realize the story they rehearsed is no longer being performed. Daniel was the first to break it, not with anger, with disbelief. He looked from the man beside me to the movers, and back again, like the scene might rearrange itself if he stared long enough. He said, "This does not make sense." It came out flat, smaller than he probably intended. My mother stepped forward then. Her voice shook, but she tried to soften it. "There must be a misunderstanding," she said. "We were only trying to simplify things. For the family," that word again, family. The man beside me did not react emotionally. He simply opened his folder and handed my father a document. This notice records today's attempted transfer and serves as formal warning. Any further action will be addressed through legal channels. My father took the paper without speaking. His confidence had evaporated. The shoulders that had squared so firmly when they arrived now slumped as if the air had been let out of him. He did not argue, he did not threaten, he just stared at the page like it had personally betrayed him. One of the movers cleared his throat again, louder this time. "So are we good to leave?" "Yes," the man said, without looking away from my family. "You should leave." That was the moment everything shifted from confrontation to consequence. The movers did not need to be told twice. One climbed back into the truck, the other followed, already apologizing under his breath. The engine started, gravel crunched, the truck began backing out slowly, like it wanted to escape the tension as much as anyone else. Daniel stood frozen. The folder he had brought drooped in his hand. Papers he had been so confident about minutes earlier now looked thin and useless. He turned to me again, his voice sharp with panic. "This is not over." I nodded once. "Maybe. That part is up to you." That answer unsettled him more than anger ever could. My mother reached for my arm. "How could you do this to us?" she asked. "After everything we have done for you." I did not pull away. I did not raise my voice. I simply said, "You showed up with movers. You told me I was out by Friday. You did not ask. You decided." She opened her mouth, then closed it. There was no version of that moment where she could argue her way out. My father folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He looked older suddenly, tired. He did not meet my eyes. "We are leaving," he said quietly. And they did. No final threats. No dramatic exit. Just retreat. I watched them walk to the car, the way people do when they realize they have misjudged the ground beneath them. Carefully, without confidence, Daniel got in last, slamming the door harder than necessary. The car pulled away, the gravel settled, the sound faded. The man beside me closed his folder. "They will think twice before trying that again," he said. I thanked him and watched him leave too. Then it was just me in the house. I stood there longer than I needed to, letting the quiet return fully. My hands were steady, my breathing even. I was not shaking. That surprised me. The victory, if you can call it that, did not feel triumphant. It felt complete. What followed was not explosive fallout. It was collapse. Messages slowed. Calls stopped. A week later, a formal notice arrived from their attorney, brief and stiff, withdrawing all claims and requesting no further contact. I read it once, folded it, and filed it away. Relatives reached out cautiously. Some apologized awkwardly, others stayed silent. I did not chase either reaction. I had no interest in rewriting narratives for people who had accepted the wrong one so easily. I returned to the lake house one afternoon, and unlocked the door slowly. The smell of old wood and lavender greeted me like it always had. Sunlight stretched across the floor. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I walked through each room without tension. No listening for footsteps, no preparing explanations. I made tea and sat on the porch, watching the water move in and out. For the first time, I was not waiting for something to be taken. Here is the hook that stays with me now. The loudest revenge was not what I said or did. It was the fact that I did nothing dramatic at all. I protected myself quietly. And that was enough. Now I want to know what you think. Be honest and have fun with it. If you were Daniel, would you have doubled down or disappeared just like he did? And if you were me, would you have smiled sooner or later? Drop your take in the comments. I promise I am reading them with tea on the porch. The fallout did not explode the way stories usually promise. There were no screaming phone calls, no late-night confrontations, no dramatic apologies delivered through clenched teeth. Instead, everything collapsed inward, quietly, like a structure that had been hollow for years, and finally gave up pretending it was solid. That was the hook that stayed with me, because silence can be louder than any argument when it means the power is gone. The messages stopped first. No more casual check-ins disguised as concern, no more suggestions about what made sense for the family. Days passed, then a week. The quiet felt unfamiliar at first, like a room after the air conditioner shuts off, and you suddenly notice how much noise you were tolerating. A formal letter arrived not long after, thin envelope, neutral language. Their attorney withdrew every claim connected to the house and requested no further contact. There was no apology, no explanation, just an ending typed neatly and signed at the bottom. I read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer, not out of fear, but out of closure. Relatives reached out in waves. Some sent messages that hovered between apology and curiosity. Others said nothing at all. I learned quickly which people had repeated the story they were given without asking, and which ones were quietly rethinking it now. I did not correct anyone. I did not chase understanding. The truth did not need a spokesperson anymore. One Sunday afternoon I drove back to the lake house alone. I parked where my grandparents always had, and sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary, just listening to the wind. When I unlocked the door, the familiar scent of old wood and lavender met me like it always had. Some things do not change when they are meant to stay. I walked through the rooms, slowly touching doorframes, windowsills, the small imperfections that had once been pointed out as flaws but now felt like fingerprints. There was no tension in my shoulders, no quiet preparation for confrontation, just space. That was when it hit me. Safety is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of boundaries that hold even when people test them. I made tea and sat on the porch watching the water move in and out with no urgency. The house did not feel like a prize I had defended. It felt like a promise I had kept. To myself, to my grandparents, to the version of me who learned too early how to disappear. For years I believed being quiet was the same as being kind. I believed avoiding conflict meant maturity. What I understand now is that kindness without boundaries is just self-erasure in better lighting. Silence can be powerful, but only when it is chosen, not imposed. I thought about Daniel then, about my parents, about the family I once tried so hard to stay aligned with. I did not feel anger, I felt clarity. They had not lost something that belonged to them, they had simply failed to take something that never did. That distinction matters. The house stood the same as it always had, steady and unbothered by the storm that had passed through it. I realized my grandparents had taught me this lesson long before any paperwork existed. Protect what you are responsible for. Show up consistently. Do not explain yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. If you are still listening, this is the part meant for you. If you have ever been made to feel selfish for protecting what matters. If you have ever been labeled difficult for setting a boundary. If you have ever stayed quiet too long hoping someone would finally see you, this story is not just mine. It is ours. Here is the hook that stays with me now. The strongest revenge was not taking something back, it was refusing to give it away ever again. If you want to hear more stories like this where quiet choices change everything, subscribe to the channel. We tell stories about family betrayal, survival, and the moments that redefine who gets to decide your worth. And if this story resonated with you like this video, so it reaches someone who needs it tonight, you are not alone, and the next story is already waiting.